The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small veterinary clinic in Tucson as Dr. Mary Smith finished examining her last patient of the day. It was July 15, 1988, and the temperature had reached a scorching 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The air conditioning unit wheezed and struggled against the desert heat, providing little relief in the cramped examination room. "There you go, Whiskers," Mary said softly, gently placing the tabby cat back into its carrier. "Those antibiotics should clear up that infection in no time." She turned to Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had brought the cat in. "Make sure he takes the full course, even if he seems better in a few days." Mrs. Henderson nodded gratefully. "Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. You're a godsend to this community." Mary smiled wearily. At 32, she had been running the Desert Paws Veterinary Clinic for 5 years, ever since moving to Arizona from her hometown in Ohio. The practice was small but served a vital role in the sprawling desert community on the outskirts of Tucson. Many of her clients drove hours from remote ranches and mobile home parks scattered across the Sonoran Desert. As Mrs. Henderson left with Whiskers, Mary heard the familiar sound of paws padding across the linoleum floor. Duke, her golden retriever, appeared in the doorway, his thick coat somehow managing to look pristine despite the desert conditions. His intelligent brown eyes met hers, and his tail wagged slowly. "Ready to head home, boy?" Mary asked, scratching behind his ears. Duke had been her constant companion since veterinary school. She had found him as a puppy, abandoned outside her dormitory during a particularly harsh winter in Colorado. Now 6 years old, he was not just her pet, but her partner in the clinic, offering comfort to anxious animals and their owners alike. Duke barked once, a sound that Mary had learned meant yes over their years together. She gathered her keys and medical bag, switching off the lights in the clinic. The parking lot was empty except for her dusty Ford pickup truck, its blue paint faded from years under the relentless Arizona sun. The drive home took them through the heart of the desert, past towering saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels against the orange and pink sky. Mary lived in a modest adobe house about 10 miles from the clinic, surrounded by nothing but desert wilderness and the occasional roadrunner darting across the dirt road. As they pulled into her driveway, Duke began to whine softly, his ears perked up and alert. Mary noticed it too, an unusual stillness in the air, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes beginning their nightly chorus. "What is it, Duke?" she asked, but the dog was already out of the truck, his nose to the ground, following some invisible trail. Mary followed him around to the back of her house, where she kept a small garden that she struggled to maintain in the harsh climate. Duke's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, his whines turning to short, sharp barks. "Duke, come here," Mary called, but for the first time she could remember, he didn't obey. Instead, he continued to pace along the edge of her property, where the maintained yard gave way to wild desert. The sun was setting rapidly, as it always did in the desert, and Mary knew that once darkness fell, the temperature would drop dramatically. But more importantly, the desert would come alive with creatures that posed real dangers. Coyotes, javelinas, and even the occasional mountain lion roamed these parts after dark. "Duke," she called more firmly, "come inside now." But Duke had found something. He stood rigid at the property line, his body language indicating he had detected something significant. Mary approached cautiously, pulling a flashlight from her pocket. In the beam of light, she could see what had captured Duke's attention: fresh tire tracks in the sand and scattered around them, several pieces of what looked like raw meat. Mary's blood ran cold. She had heard stories from other ranchers about people using poisoned bait to kill dogs and wild animals. The practice was illegal, but not uncommon in areas where livestock was threatened by predators. "Duke, no!" she shouted, but it was too late. The golden retriever had already consumed one of the pieces of meat. Within minutes, Duke began to stagger. His breathing became labored, and foam appeared around his mouth. Mary's veterinary training kicked in immediately. This was clearly poisoning, and she had only minutes to act. She ran to her truck, Duke stumbling behind her, and drove frantically back toward the clinic. But halfway there, Duke began to convulse. Mary pulled over and tried to induce vomiting, but the poison was working too quickly. "Stay with me, boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held his large head in her lap. "Please stay with me." Duke's breathing became more and more shallow. His eyes, usually so bright and alert, began to glaze over. But then, with what seemed like his last bit of strength, he struggled to his feet and began walking into the desert. "Duke, no! Come back!" Mary called, but the dog continued walking, his gait unsteady but determined. She followed him for nearly a mile into the darkness, calling his name, but eventually lost sight of him among the towering cacti and rocky outcroppings. Mary searched until dawn, calling Duke's name until her voice was hoarse. She contacted the local sheriff's department, posted flyers throughout the community, and spent every free moment for weeks combing the desert. But Duke had vanished completely, as if the desert had simply swallowed him whole. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Tom Rodriguez, had been sympathetic but realistic. "Ma'am, I've seen this before. Animals that are poisoned or badly hurt, they often go off to die alone. It's instinct. I'm sorry, but after this long in this heat, well..." Mary refused to give up hope. But as weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, she was forced to accept that Duke was gone. The clinic felt empty without him, and many of her clients commented on his absence. Children who had visited with their pets would ask where the nice golden dog had gone, and Mary would simply say he had moved away. 12 years passed like pages turning in a book Mary didn't want to read. The Desert Paws Veterinary Clinic had grown considerably since 1988. What had once been a single examination room had expanded into a full-service animal hospital with 3 examination rooms, a surgical suite, and a boarding facility. Mary, now 44, had hired 2 additional veterinarians and a staff of 6 to help manage the increased caseload. The community around Tucson had grown as well. What had once been isolated ranches and mobile home parks had developed into suburban neighborhoods, complete with shopping centers and schools. The desert that had once seemed endless was now crisscrossed with roads and dotted with housing developments. On the morning of July 15, 2000, exactly 12 years to the day since Duke's disappearance, Mary was reviewing surgical notes in her office when her receptionist, Jennifer, knocked on the door. "Dr. Smith, there's something you need to see out front," Jennifer said, her voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and disbelief. Mary looked up from her paperwork, noting the strange expression on Jennifer's face. "What is it? Another emergency?" "Just, please come look," Jennifer insisted. Mary followed her to the front desk, where the waiting room had fallen completely silent. Every person in the room, clients with their pets, staff members, even the mail carrier who had been making his delivery, stood frozen, staring out the large front windows. Mary approached the window and felt her heart stop. Sitting calmly in the parking lot, directly in front of the clinic's main entrance, was a golden retriever. The dog was clearly elderly, his once lustrous coat now faded and thin, his muzzle completely white with age. But there was something unmistakably familiar about his posture, the way he held his head, the intelligent expression in his eyes. "Duke," Mary whispered, her hand pressed against the glass. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, even through the window. His tail began to wag slowly, just as it had thousands of times before. Mary rushed outside, her staff and clients following behind her. The Arizona sun was just as brutal as it had been 12 years earlier, but Mary barely noticed. She approached the dog slowly, afraid that sudden movement might cause him to disappear again like a mirage. "Duke, is it really you, boy?" she asked softly. The dog stood and walked toward her, his gait stiff with age but unmistakably familiar. As he drew closer, Mary could see that he was carrying something in his mouth, a small, weathered leather pouch. When Duke reached Mary, he sat down and gently placed the pouch at her feet, just as he had been trained to do with medical supplies years ago. His tail wagged more vigorously now, and he looked up at her with eyes that, despite being clouded with age, still held that same intelligent spark she remembered. Mary knelt down and embraced the dog, tears streaming down her face. Duke's coat was thin and patchy, and she could feel his ribs beneath his skin, but he was alive. Impossibly, miraculously alive. "Where have you been, boy?" she whispered into his fur. "Where have you been all these years?" Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of Mary's associate veterinarians, approached cautiously. "Dr. Smith? Is this really—" "It's Duke," Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how, but it's really him." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur in amazement. Several of Mary's longtime clients remembered Duke from years past, and word began to spread quickly through the community about the miraculous return. Mary picked up the leather pouch that Duke had carried. It was old and weathered, the leather cracked from years of exposure to the desert sun. Inside, she found a collection of items that made her gasp. A faded photograph of herself and Duke, taken outside the clinic in 1987, a small metal tag with Duke's name and her old phone number, and a handwritten note on paper that had yellowed with age. The note was written in shaky handwriting. "This dog saved my life. I have cared for him as he cared for me. Now it is time for him to go home. E.M." Mary looked down at Duke, who was watching her with patient eyes. "Who is E.M.? Boy? Who took care of you all these years?" Duke simply wagged his tail and leaned against her leg, content to be home. Dr. Martinez offered to examine Duke immediately, and Mary agreed, though she was reluctant to let him out of her sight even for a moment. The examination revealed that despite his age and obvious hardships, Duke was in remarkably good health. He was underweight and showed signs of arthritis, but his vital signs were strong. "It's incredible, Doctor," Martinez said as she completed the examination. "For a dog his age, especially one that's been living in the desert for 12 years, his condition is remarkable. Someone has been taking very good care of him." Mary spent the rest of the day with Duke, watching as he slowly reacquainted himself with the clinic. He remembered where his old food and water bowls had been kept, and he instinctively knew to avoid the examination rooms when they were in use. It was as if no time had passed at all. As evening approached, Mary prepared to take Duke home. She had called ahead to have her current dogs, 2 rescue mutts named Ranger and Scout, temporarily boarded at the clinic to give Duke time to readjust. The drive home followed the same route they had taken 12 years earlier, though the landscape had changed dramatically. Where once there had been open desert, now there were strip malls and gas stations. Duke sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, taking in the familiar yet altered scenery. When they arrived at Mary's house, Duke walked directly to the spot where he had disappeared all those years ago. He sniffed around the area for several minutes, then returned to Mary's side, as if confirming that this was indeed home. Over the following weeks, Mary devoted herself to nursing Duke back to full health. She adjusted his diet to help him gain weight, started him on medication for his arthritis, and spent hours each day simply enjoying his company. The reunion had been covered by local news stations, and the story of Duke's miraculous return had touched hearts throughout Arizona and beyond. But Mary couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious note and the initials E.M. She was determined to find out who had cared for Duke during his 12-year absence. The leather pouch that Duke had carried became her most treasured possession, and she would often hold the faded photograph of them together, wondering about the journey that had brought it back to her. Duke seemed to sense her curiosity about his missing years. Sometimes in the evenings, he would stand at the edge of her property and look out toward the desert with a distant expression in his eyes. Mary noticed that he had developed habits that were new to her. He would carefully inspect his food before eating, as if checking for something specific, and he showed an unusual awareness of desert sounds that had never concerned him before. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had brought her cat Whiskers to the clinic on the day Duke disappeared, visited with a new kitten and mentioned the story to Mary. "You know, Doctor Smith, that story about Duke reminds me of something," Mrs. Henderson said as Mary examined her kitten. "My late husband used to tell stories about an old hermit who lived way out in the desert, past the old mining claims. Said the man's name was Eduardo something. Eduardo Martinez, I think. Folks called him Desert Eddie. My husband always said Eddie had a way with animals, that hurt creatures would find their way to him somehow." Mary's heart raced. "Eduardo Martinez, E.M. Do you know if he's still out there?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. "Oh, honey, this was years ago. My husband passed in 1995, and he said even then that Eddie was getting on in years. But if you're curious, you might ask Tom Rodriguez. He's retired from the sheriff's department now, but he knew everyone in these parts." That evening, Mary called Tom Rodriguez, the former sheriff who had helped search for Duke 12 years earlier. Tom, now in his 70s, remembered Eduardo Martinez well. "Desert Eddie," Tom said with a chuckle. "Haven't thought about him in years. He was a character, that's for sure. Lived way out past the old copper mines, must have been 30 miles from your place. He was a Vietnam veteran. Came back from the war pretty messed up, if you know what I mean. Couldn't handle being around people much, so he went to live in the desert." Tom's voice grew more serious as he continued. "Eddie was different from other folks who tried to live off the grid. He had real skills, medical training from the army, engineering knowledge, and an almost supernatural understanding of desert survival. I remember responding to a few calls over the years where hikers or hunters had gotten lost, and we'd find them safe and sound near Eddie's place. He never took credit, but we knew he'd helped them. "Is he still alive?" Mary asked. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Well, I haven't heard from him in a few years, but last I knew he was still out there. He'd come into town maybe once or twice a year for supplies, always paid in cash, never caused any trouble. Some folks thought he was crazy, but I always figured he was just trying to find peace in his own way. The man had seen things in Vietnam that would break most people." Tom gave Mary directions to Eduardo's approximate location, warning her that the terrain was rough and that she should take plenty of water and tell someone where she was going. He also mentioned that Eduardo had a reputation for helping injured animals, which made Mary even more certain that this was the man who had cared for Duke. The next Saturday, Mary set out into the desert with Duke riding beside her in her truck. She had prepared extensively for the journey, packing extra water, emergency supplies, and a satellite phone in case they encountered trouble. The journey took them far beyond the developed areas, deep into the Sonoran Desert, where the landscape looked much as it had for thousands of years. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Mary noticed that Duke became increasingly alert and excited. His ears were perked up, and he began making soft whining sounds that she recognized as expressions of anticipation. It was clear that he knew exactly where they were going. After nearly 2 hours of driving on increasingly rough dirt roads, they reached the area Tom had described. The landscape here was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Towering rock formations carved by millennia of wind and water, ancient saguaro cacti that had stood for centuries, and a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Mary parked the truck and began walking, following Duke, who seemed to know exactly where he was going. His arthritis appeared forgotten as he moved with purpose through the desert terrain, occasionally stopping to sniff at familiar landmarks or to look back and make sure Mary was following. They hiked for about a mile through a landscape of towering saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings before Duke led her to a small canyon hidden between 2 ridges. The entrance was so well concealed that Mary would never have found it without Duke's guidance. There, nestled against the canyon wall and almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a modest dwelling built from desert stone and salvaged materials. Solar panels provided electricity, and a small windmill pumped water from a well. It was a masterpiece of desert survival, perfectly adapted to the harsh environment. Gardens of desert plants surrounded the dwelling, and Mary could see that they had been carefully cultivated to provide both food and medicine. As they approached, an elderly man emerged from the dwelling. He was tall and lean, his skin weathered by decades in the desert sun, his hair and beard completely white. But his eyes were kind, and when he saw Duke, his weathered face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "I wondered when you'd bring him home," Eduardo Martinez said to Mary. "He's been getting restless lately, talking about you more and more." Mary stared at the man in amazement. "You're Eduardo Martinez. You're the one who took care of Duke all these years." Eduardo nodded, kneeling down to scratch Duke behind the ears. The reunion between man and dog was touching to witness. Duke's tail wagged furiously as he nuzzled against Eduardo's weathered hands, and the old man's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Found him that night 12 years ago," Eduardo said, his voice rough with emotion. "He was in bad shape, poisoned and dying. Took me 3 days to nurse him back to health, and by then, well, I guess we'd both decided we needed each other. But why didn't you bring him back? I searched for months. I never gave up hope." Eduardo's expression grew sad, and he gestured for Mary to sit on a bench he had carved from desert wood. "I tried at first, but Duke, he was scared. Whoever poisoned him, they'd been watching your place. I saw them come back twice in the first few weeks, looking around. Duke wouldn't go near your property. Every time I tried to take him back, he'd panic and run deeper into the desert." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. "Someone was watching my house? There was a development company that wanted your land," Eduardo explained, his voice taking on a harder edge. "They figured if they could scare you away, make you feel unsafe, you'd sell cheap. Poisoning your dog was just the beginning. But when Duke disappeared instead of dying, they gave up and moved on to easier targets. I kept an eye on things for a while, made sure they didn't try anything else." Eduardo led them to a shaded area where several water bowls and food dishes were arranged. Mary could see that this was clearly a place where many animals had been cared for over the years. Duke became my partner out here. He helped me rescue other animals, coyotes caught in traps, birds with broken wings, even a mountain lion cub whose mother had been killed. He had a gift for finding creatures that needed help. As if to demonstrate, Duke walked over to a large enclosure where a red-tailed hawk with a splinted wing perched on a branch. The bird showed no fear of the dog, and Duke sat quietly nearby as if checking on an old friend. Mary watched in amazement as several other animals emerged from various shelters around the property. A three-legged coyote, a blind desert tortoise, and a family of javelinas that had clearly been hand-raised. "He never forgot you, though," Eduardo continued, watching Mary's reaction to his desert sanctuary. "Every year on the anniversary of the day I found him, he'd get restless and start walking toward town. I always had to talk him out of it, tell him it wasn't time yet. But this year was different. He was determined to go home, and I knew I couldn't stop him anymore. He's getting old, and he deserves to spend his final years with the person he loves most." Mary wiped tears from her eyes. "Why didn't you come with him? You could have explained." Eduardo shook his head, looking out over the vast desert landscape. "This desert is my home now. I'm not built for the world out there anymore. Too many people, too much noise, too many memories I'd rather leave buried. But Duke, he belongs with you. He always has. I was just keeping him safe until it was time for him to return." They spent the afternoon with Eduardo, learning about the life he and Duke had shared. Eduardo showed them his extensive knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal properties, many of which he had used to keep Duke healthy over the years. He had built a small animal hospital of sorts, complete with surgical tools and medical supplies, where he treated injured wildlife before releasing them back into the desert. "Duke was my assistant," Eduardo said with pride, showing Mary a detailed log he had kept of every animal they had helped. He could sense when an animal was in pain, could calm them down better than any tranquilizer. "He saved more lives out here than you might imagine. There were times when I thought about giving up, when the loneliness got too heavy, but Duke would bring me some injured creature that needed help, and I'd remember why I was here." Eduardo also showed Mary the small workshop where he had crafted the leather pouch that Duke had carried home. "I made that for him about 5 years ago," he explained. "I knew that someday he would want to go home, and I wanted him to have something to carry his memories in. The photograph was his most treasured possession. He would carry it with him whenever we went on long trips into the desert." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in brilliant shades of orange and red, Mary knew it was time to leave. Eduardo packed a small bag of Duke's favorite treats and handed Mary a detailed journal he had kept of Duke's health over the years. "Everything's in there," he said. "Every vaccination I managed to give him, every injury he sustained, every illness he fought off. He's had a good life out here, but he's earned the right to spend his final years in comfort." Mary hugged the old man, this stranger who had become Duke's guardian angel. "How can I ever thank you? You saved his life and you gave him purpose. You gave him 12 years I thought were lost forever." Eduardo smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Just love him. That's all he's ever wanted. And maybe, if you're willing, you could visit sometimes. It gets lonely out here, and I'd like to hear how he's doing." As they prepared to leave, Duke walked over to Eduardo and sat down in front of him. The two old friends looked at each other for a long moment, and Mary could swear she saw understanding pass between them. Duke gently licked Eduardo's hand, then walked back to Mary's side, but not before looking back one more time at the man who had been his companion for so many years. "He'll be back to visit," Eduardo said confidently, watching as Duke settled into the truck. "This desert is in his blood now, just like it's in mine. And when his time comes, if you're willing, I'd like him to be buried out here, where he learned to be wild again." The drive home was quiet, with Duke sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat. Mary thought about the incredible journey her dog had taken, the life he had lived in the desert, and the man who had saved him and given him purpose for 12 years. She realized that Duke's disappearance, which had seemed like such a tragedy, had actually been a blessing in disguise, not just for Duke, but for Eduardo and all the animals they had helped together. When they arrived home, Duke walked around the property one more time, as if reacquainting himself with every familiar scent and sight. Then he settled down on his old bed, which Mary had kept all these years, and fell into a deep, contented sleep. Over the following months, Duke became a local celebrity. His story was featured in newspapers and magazines across the country, and people would drive for hours just to meet the dog who had survived 12 years in the Arizona desert. But for Mary, the most important thing was simply having her old friend back. True to Eduardo's prediction, Duke would occasionally become restless and look toward the desert with longing in his eyes. Mary began making regular trips to visit Eduardo, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. These visits became a source of joy for all three of them, and Mary found herself learning about desert survival and wildlife rehabilitation from the old hermit. Duke lived for 3 more years after his return, years filled with comfort, love, and the occasional visit to Eduardo in the desert. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 21, Mary buried him on her property with a headstone that read, "Duke, a true friend who found his way home." Eduardo attended the funeral, his first trip into town in over 15 years. He stood quietly beside Mary as they said goodbye to their shared companion, and then disappeared back into the desert, carrying with him the memory of a golden retriever who had taught them both about loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bonds between friends. Mary continued to run her veterinary clinic, but she never forgot the lessons Duke's return had taught her. She established a fund to help rescue and rehabilitate desert wildlife, and every year on July 15th, she would drive out to visit Eduardo, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. The story of Duke's miraculous return became legend in the Arizona desert, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the incredible resilience of the bonds between humans and animals. And sometimes on quiet desert evenings, local ranchers would swear they could see a golden shape moving through the saguaro cacti, still watching over the creatures of the desert, still finding his way home. Thank you for watching this incredible true story of loyalty and survival. If you enjoyed Duke's amazing journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us what city you're watching from and share any similar stories about the special bonds between you and your pets. Remember, we bring you new inspiring stories every single day, so make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love and loyalty, and we'll see you tomorrow with another unforgettable story.